ministering there, healing the sick, preaching and teaching, and his ministry, by and large, has been very well received in Galilee. In fact, people who are very far from God actually find their way back to God through his early ministry in Galilee. Well then, in chapter 9, there is a pivotal moment. In verse 51, Jesus sets his face to go down towards Jerusalem. Now, that 70-mile trip that he's going to take down towards Jerusalem is going to be one that is marked with an increasing amount of tension. For the first time, his disciples are going to see that he's not warmly received every place that he goes. And indeed, that is what we find in this passage here. So this passage really raises an interesting question, which is, how do we as Christians respond to a world that maybe doesn't receive the message of Jesus Christ favorably? This is Luke 9:51 through 56. When the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But the Samaritans did not receive him, because his face was set towards Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. I'm going to pause right here. There are some ancient manuscripts that have the words behind Jesus' rebuke. Not all the ancient manuscripts are exactly alike. Some of them have additional things. These words probably were not original to the text, but nonetheless, they date very early in the manuscripts. They say that Jesus said these words. Jesus said, "You do not know of what spirit you are, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy souls, but to save them." Then they went on to another village. Sort of reveals to us this sense that the next 9 chapters, as Jesus is traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, that Jesus has a singular purpose in mind, right? Which is that Jesus came to seek out and to save the lost. Now, here's what I want you to do for just one second. I want you to picture for me the last time that you were fuming mad, smoke coming out of your ears, ready to call down fire from heaven. Can you remember that time? What was it for you? I want to share with you the thing that it was for me. Now, for some of you, you might be going through some more consequential things than maybe I'm going through at this juncture in my life. So this might seem a little trivial to you, but for me, the last time that I was fuming mad, smoke coming out of my ears, ready to call down fire from heaven, was when we were trying to install a microwave in our kitchen. I'm not tremendously handy, and so we're also pretty thrifty. And so we bought a microwave from Home Depot, and we were too thrifty to want to pay the $75 for Home Depot to come and install the microwave for us. So one evening, Lauren and I put the kids to bed, and we watched a couple YouTube videos about how to de-install a microwave. And we got the microwave off the wall, and then, you know that point in every project that you start around your house where you begin to realize that the scope that you expected of the project is no longer going to be the actual reality of the scope of the project, which happens about 2 minutes in to every project. We realized that this was going to be a significantly different event. So we get the microwave off the wall and discover that there's a massive gaping hole in the drywall, which we did not put there, behind the microwave, and that the previous people who had installed a microwave did so by wiring it directly to the fuse box in the basement. In short, there is no outlet for us to just plug in a new microwave to. So the scope of the project is not exactly what we expected it to be. The reality looks quite different. The reason I tell you this story is because I think that most of the time, when we have anxiety or frustration or anger, it comes because there's a conflict between what we expect and what the reality is. Anytime that we have anxiety or frustration or anger, a lot of times it's because there's a conflict between what we expect and what we experience in reality. So think about that time for you when you were fuming mad, smoke coming out of your ears, ready to call down fire from heaven, what was it for you? Maybe it was that you never thought, you never expected that your kids were going to make those decisions. Or maybe you never in a million years expected your marriage to end up in this place. Or maybe you never saw that torpedo coming at work and never saw that layoff coming. Or maybe for you, you never expected in a million years that it would be these candidates that we have to vote for. Oftentimes, there is this discrepancy between what we expect and what the reality is, and when that happens, there's all sorts of anxiety and frustration and sometimes anger that starts bubbling up. Well, I believe this is exactly what Jesus was experiencing in Luke 9:51. Right, for the disciples, they got called in about Luke chapter 5, and they've been following Jesus around. Every village that they went into, they were warmly received, with the exception of one time in Luke chapter 6. But they were pretty much warmly received. People were flocking to Jesus, eager to welcome him to the village. And now, Jesus sends them to Samaria. Now, a quick point here. If you were going to travel from Galilee, where they've been doing ministry, down to Samaria, there'd probably be about 3 routes that you would take. There would be the Transjordan route, which went along the Jordan River, which went to the east side of Samaria. There would be the coastal route, which went along the Mediterranean Sea, which would have also avoided Samaria. And most Jews would have taken that route because Jews and Samaritans didn't get along. And yet Jesus sends his disciples straight through Samaria, which starts to develop this theme that Jesus has a heart for those who are outside the church, that he truly came to seek out and to save the lost. So Jesus sends his disciples into Samaria, and the Samaritans do not receive him because he was going to Jerusalem and he was a Jewish man. So his disciples respond, "Jesus, would you like us to call down fire from heaven and have them consumed?" And Jesus rebukes them. Isn't that such a standard response? When our expectations and the realities that we experience don't match up, we respond with all sorts of rage. And isn't it a typical response from a religious person when things don't go our way, that we want to call down the wrath of God on people? And yet Jesus rebukes them. Now, I think this message is incredibly relevant for our lives today, because I believe that you and I live in a state of perpetual cultural anxiety. If you think back to 2008, most of us never expected the Great Recession. We never expected that careers were going to dry up and that our economy was going to slow down. And when our reality was that, against our expectations, there's been this sort of cultural angst around it, maybe even leading to the political climate that we're in right now. Most of us never expected certain bubbles to pop, like the fact that our houses aren't worth what we thought they were worth anymore. And again, it feeds into this anxiety. And I believe not only as Americans, but as Christians, we experience a lot of this anxiety too. Because for nearly 1,600 years, from about the 4th century to the mid-20th century, the church had power and influence and authority and voice in our culture. In fact, the moral framework, the moral compass of our culture was given to it primarily by the church. And now, that is no longer the case. Maybe there are people here who are sitting that they remember that time when the church had voice and power and influence and authority, but by and large, that's gone away, and now you feel this sense of loss. And the expectations that you had about the influence that the church was going to have, having not been met by reality now, there's this sort of anxiety and this feeling that our culture has gone way off course. Well, I think we need this passage then. Well, I submit to you that as there were bubbles that popped when our Great Recession happened, that there are certain bubbles that need to pop for us to understand today the call of Christ for our lives. The first bubble that needs to pop for us to understand the reality of the framework that we live in is this: that Christianity has moved from being in the center of our culture to being on the margins. We've gone from being the cultural compass to now being on the outskirts with no voice, power, authority, or influence. And if we receive this as the reality for today, the only thing that's going to dispel that angst and lead us to be in a place that we don't want to call down fire from heaven on those people that have caused that to happen is this: Jesus came to seek out and save the lost. Do you know that there's nearly 100 million people in the United States that are not connected to any church today? Of those 100 million people in the United States, about 15% of them probably have some sort of Judeo-Christian worldview. That leaves about 85 million people in the United States that have no connection to the church, which is about 26% of our population. All of this means that in the last 10 years or so, about every year, 3,500 churches have closed annually. And of the churches that are staying open, 80% of them are either plateaued or are in the decline. We live in a world where Christianity has moved from the center to the margins. We are no longer the primary influence, and we need to come to terms with that. But not in such a way that we call down fire from heaven, but in such a way that we respond by pursuing the mission of Christ, which was to seek out and to save the lost. The second bubble that I think needs to pop for us to come to the reality of what our culture is like is that we need to know that simply opening the doors on Sunday mornings isn't going to draw people to the church anymore. Because the culture has moved, because Christianity has moved within our culture from the center to the margins, people are not waking up on Sunday mornings as they used to thinking, I should really go to church today. That cultural anxiety of I need to be in church just does not exist anymore. Additionally, a better show, more lights, pyrotechnics, those things aren't going to draw people to church either. And the third bubble that I think needs to pop for us to come to terms with the reality of the world that we live in today is that the church needs to move from a model of maintenance where we try to preserve what was to pursuing the mission of God in the world. We need to reaffirm the mission of Christ, his heart to seek and save the lost. And if we have that mission sense about us, we will pursue after the things that Christ pursued in this world. Well, this is sermon 1 of about a 6-week sermon series that we're doing this summer. Next week, we're going to take a week off because we're going to be doing a patriotic theme for the 4th of July weekend. But in the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about what it looks like to do ministry in a world that has changed from up underneath us. So we're going to be talking about things like being an everyday church. You're going to see that over and over, that we need to be a church that is engaged in ministry every single day. We're going to be talking about being a church that has an everyday community. You know, in a world that longs for social connection, where we see social media at an all-time high, where over 1 billion people are using Facebook, there are still many, many, many lonely people in the world. And statistics have shown that Facebook and social media and even text messaging doesn't do anything to the brain to curb people's loneliness. What the church offers in community, if it's lived out in everyday life, has absolute value for our culture. The second thing we're going to talk about is that we need to have an everyday pastoral care. Now, sometimes when we think about pastoral care, we think about the role of the pastor, right? That the pastor visits sick people, the pastor calls on people who are homebound, the pastor visits people in the hospitals. But that's not what we mean by everyday pastoral care. And I think we in the Presbyterian Church actually have a unique viewpoint on this, because we believe in the priesthood of all believers. In short, that every member of the church is a minister of God. That every one of us has a role to play, has gifts for ministry, and that part of our task as disciples is to discern how God has uniquely wired us to work in the world. And so we need to surround each other with pastoral care and surround our connections with people outside the church with pastoral care. In the third week, we're going to talk about everyday mission. Everyday mission is this idea that mission isn't just this percentage of our budget that we give towards philanthropic things. Mission is what each and every one of us are engaged in every single day. That God has a mission for the world and that we get invited to participate in what God is doing. And so as we surround ourselves and as we surround ourselves with the presence of God and try to live into God's mission, we will be everyday missionaries. And then finally, we're going to talk about everyday evangelism. The idea that each one of us has social networks that we are plugged into, and that we are to be people who are reaching out with the love of Christ in those contexts. So I shared with you some staggering statistics about how the church is on the decline in America. This has led some people to say that the church is dead in the West, or that God is dead. Is this so? Is there any hope for us? Well, I say emphatically yes, by all means. In fact, the church has historically done best when the boot of the empire's on its neck. In the first century world, when Christianity exploded across Jerusalem and into Rome, the boot of the Roman Empire was against it. And the church grew by leaps and bounds as the Christian people were empowered by the Holy Spirit to reach into it. And secondly, Jesus himself promised that the gates of Hades would not stand against the church. That there's nothing that can stop the church that is Spirit empowered. And the Spirit is alive in this place. But it's going to require of us to become an everyday church.